Critical theory is a theoretical approach that can be used in qualitative research. Critical theory was established by Max Horkheimer in 1937. Horkheimer and a few colleagues developed a school of thought referred to as the Frankfurt School, which continued work on critical theory to develop it into a full theoretical platform. After critical theory was established by Horkheimer, it was then evolved by other theorists such as Adorno, Habermas, and Marcuse. Habermas is primarily the one attributed with the modern version of critical theory. While critical theory was primarily established to critique economic theory and capitalist structures, it expanded to be a more broad critique of society, literature, and other cultural forms. As an idea, critical theory can trace its genealogy through ideas produced by Immanuel Kant and Karl Marx. Critical theory and postmodernism have very different origins. Most distinctly, critical theory comes from German philosophy, and postmodernism is more closely aligned with French philosophy. Previously, I mentioned that Adorno and Habermas were among those that were involved in critical theory. They're German philosophers. Whereas postmodernism was established and can be traced through philosophers such as Michel Foucault or Jacques Derrida. Postmodernism and critical theory both seek to reject academic boundaries. That is, they don't embrace the idea of separating different realms of social experience from each other. They utilize what Best and Kellner describe as supradisciplinary discourses. Both theoretical approaches provide a critique of social systems, hegemonic power, and capitalism. Critical theory retains certain categories of social theory, such as commodification, economic systems, class structures, etc. This is distinct from postmodernism, which seeks to overthrow much of traditional philosophy, existing social theory, and pretty much any existing concepts that have been created to understand the structure of society. An area where this is problematic is postmodernism disassociates power from capitalist systems. Whereas critical theory was established primarily to address issues of capitalism and the establishment of power, the function of human capital in establishing hierarchies, postmodernism wishes to completely dispense with that and not use that as a basis for understanding power relations. Critical theory is distinct from a lot of other social theory and philosophical theories for understanding society because it seeks to be more active. Most existing theoretical frameworks attempt to understand society, attempt to provide a way of explaining why certain things function the way they do. Critical theory does that too, but it goes a step further. Critical theory is designed to liberate humans from systems of power. Part of the way this is done is by revealing hidden power structures, revealing systems that exist and are reinforced by themselves. Critical theory seeks to denormalize social assumptions and challenge existing hegemonic structures. Part of the way that critical theory can be implemented is to let the research be a tool for change. Obviously, a single piece of research written through the critical lens is not in itself going to create change. However, the process of creating the research can generate small pieces of change by raising awareness of the subjects of research, of raising awareness of the researcher, or in bringing an awareness of a social reality to a group of academics who can then continue that theme throughout their own research. Critical theory is certainly not a way to approach any sort of research that would seek to describe itself as objective. To the contrary, critical theory would describe all research as subjective and would seek to understand the context in which the research is conducted. With critical research, everything has a story. Every culture, every society, every individual has some unique characteristics, some context that contributed to their existence, to the way that they experience the world, the way they experience their own identity. That is what critical theory can help us do. To understand these various experiences and why they are important. So, as a researcher, why would you use critical theory? Well, for one, it's a good guide for working with things like participant research. Critical theory allows the researcher to give voice to marginalized populations. Through critical theory research, you can also reveal bias and subjectivity in previous research that had claimed itself to be objective. By conducting a meta-analysis of existing research, it is possible to provide new insights into the context in which research was conducted. Critical theory can also be used to identify systems that make categorical assumptions. Research that describes itself as objective is based in assumptions. Quantitative research, for example, makes assumptions about what the data means. There is meaning given to numbers that are not intrinsically linked with the subjects that the data describes. Even in qualitative research, it is possible for this function of assumption to occur. Think back to establishing interview questions. Interview questions are written with a certain assumption about the type of information you're going to get. Certain preconceived notions of what the experience of the interviewee is like. It provides structure to research, but it also eliminates the possibility for the voice of the participant to be truly heard. Critical theory asks the researcher to step back from that, to take a look at the context, to analyze not only assumptions about the subject, but internalized beliefs that may impact the research. Our textbook provides a description of critical research. See, engage, contextualize, and make meaning of all the complexity of people's lives, society, and the social, political, institutional, and economic forces that shape them. As researchers, we have a responsibility to maintain a fidelity to the complexity and layeredness of people's complicated experiences, identifying and resisting hegemonic hierarchy and power symmetries, working against binaries and deficit thinking. Our textbook definition of what doing research critically is doesn't leave open the possibility for passive research. The researcher is not simply receiving data and analyzing data. The researcher has to go beyond what is on the surface to think about the context, to engage with the subjects and see them for what they are. There's also a requirement of looking for those intricacies, making sure that any sort of systematic power that has been applied that shapes our thoughts has been addressed. The research article I have selected for implementing critical theory is a 2011 article by Tricia Kress called Stepping Out of the Academic Brew, Using Critical Research to Break Down Hierarchies of Knowledge Production. I selected this particular article for several reasons. Most notably, it had a certain meta quality that appealed to me. It takes a critical lens to looking at a course that utilizes critical research. Through that process, the researcher analyzes how hierarchies of knowledge production occur and sort of the real-world impacts for that. Kress doesn't set out a specific research question in this article. This article is based on an experience that the author had while visiting a high school. Several of the author's doctoral advisees invited her to attend and be a participant in this class. The class is on a topic of social activism. Through the class, the students are learning how to implement social activism research. One research theme that emerged through the data, as well as in the experiences of the author, was the idea that knowledge is a burden. The research subjects were students in a social activism class, most of which were also participants in a club called the Young Researchers Club. The students are described by the school as being underperforming, disruptive, and many of them have attendance issues. The author describes the school the students are in as an underperforming school in Boston. As part of the class, students kept reflective journals and interacted through class discussions. The researcher utilized a document analysis of students' reflective journals, recordings of class sessions, and interviews as the data for this particular article. As with most critical theory research, Kress did not take a standardized approach, but rather has her own approach for how to utilize critical theory for research purposes. Kress focuses on deconstructing assumptions and following a systematic process for analyzing situations. She has this acronym called REDO: reveal, examine, dismantle, and open. Through this process, the author attempts to reveal her own bias by revealing her own privilege. She examines herself as well as those around her, attempts to dismantle the existing bias, the existing hierarchies that she's involved in, and then she opens herself up to a broad understanding of the situation she finds herself in, and also opens herself up to a dialogue with the subjects. Similar to the absence of coherent research questions, the findings were also a little more scattered throughout the article. They were interspersed with descriptions of the data and examples of some of the responses that students gave. Generally, students described feeling alienated by what they described as official knowledge. So that is the knowledge that is deemed to be of value by the school, the teachers, and the state mandated curriculum. Students described when they attempted to have critical engagement with courses outside the social activism class, they ended up having confrontations with teachers. So attempting to dispute a fact that an instructor had given resulted in a confrontation and the student being accused of being disruptive. One of the themes that was found was that knowledge was burdensome because it must be suppressed if it conflicts with the dominant narrative. One student had a quote that the idea that it is not really about what you know is solidifying itself each passing day. So I am left with the choice, dumb it down or forever be wasted potential. That might sound illogical since you're always told that knowledge is power, but coming from where I'm from, knowledge is a burden. The researcher describes being surprised at that particular quote in the student's journal, primarily because as a white woman of privilege, she had never encountered a situation where knowledge could ever be harmful. But in the case for this student who, both being a high school student and being a minority, resulted in the expression of the knowledge being seen as disruptive and being counter to what the school was teaching. After reflecting on that quote and her reactions, the researcher then concludes that the general theme that is found there illuminates that education is not necessarily that much of an equalizer, but is more of a regulator, and that ensures that power and wealth will remain concentrated in those who already have it. It also reveals that there are underlying struggles that disproportionately limit and are harmful to marginalized groups. Through the research, The author became aware of her own perceptions of high school students and of their capabilities. The author also became aware of her status and her privilege. So when the author first entered the high school, she had fairly low expectations of the students, both because of the school itself and the fact that they were high school students. This article is an exemplar of critical theory research because it is focused on the subject. It's not about analyzing the subject, but rather understanding the subject, the experience, their identity, and how they function in their social environment. Another way it exemplifies that theme is by the fact that the author reports her own experiences. The author reports that her perceptions were changed, that she had to confront her own ideas of what these students were capable of, and her own ideas of what being an educator was. Finally, this article calls upon the reader to develop an understanding of what a minority student experience might be, of what an experience might be for a student that brings different assets to their education. This article is about trying to create change. Even if that change is minor, the intention of the article is to create a change of attitudes, a change of perception. If nothing else, then simply to encourage the reader to look around and understand their own assumptions. Here are the resources I utilized to prepare this presentation. The Sage Dictionary of Cultural Studies provides a basic working definition of critical theory and the basics of the history. Chapter 7 of Best and Kellner's Postmodern Theory, Critical Interrogations, is a good primer to the differences between critical theory and postmodernism. This is perhaps the most enlightening resource I found on critical theory because it really does make distinctions rather than providing only a historical, theoretical perspective. Held's introduction to critical theory goes more deep into the history of critical theory, describing the formation of the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer's involvement, and then follows through with describing how Habermas took over critical theory and brought it into the modern era. Kress, of course, is the article that I utilized to put critical theory into action with stepping out of the academic brew using critical research to break down hierarchies of knowledge production. I'd seriously recommend reading through it. There's a lot more richness and depth to that article than I could possibly ever hope to accomplish relaying accurately to you through this presentation. It's definitely worth a read if you're interested in minority perspectives on education. Next up is our textbook. It provides a fairly high-level overview of the function of criticality in applied research. Rabin provides a more philosophical read of critical theory, especially with regard to implementing critical theory in social research and in understanding social inequality. One of the themes I found helpful in understanding critical theory through this article was the interdependence of the subject and the object in social research.